On a patch of dirt behind a rented shed, a young woman named Talia Rojas watches truck after truck spill out fruit nobody wants. The peaches are bruised, the plums split, the apricots so soft they collapse under their own weight. Farmers dump it for free, grateful to avoid the fees. Neighbors think she's lost her mind. But Talia has noticed something they haven't: a faint, honey-sweet scent that rises from the rotting fruit after exactly 4 days in the heat. A scent that will soon become a six-figure business. At 27, Talia Rojas was a college dropout with a half-finished microbiology degree, a notebook full of fermentation diagrams, and a growing conviction that the answer to her financial ruin was hidden inside a mountain of rotting fruit. What she discovered would redefine the craft beverage industry, and it started with a single unexpected smell. The smell arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 3.5 weeks into the experiment. It wasn't the sour, stomach-turning stench of decay most people expected from a mountain of rotting fruit baking in the California sun. It was something else entirely: honeyed, floral, almost like overripe melon crossed with fresh bread dough. Talia had been tracking it for days, packing past the pile with a cheap thermometer and a notebook that never left her back pocket. On day 4, the scent intensified enough that she knelt down, pressed her nose close to a split plum, and felt her pulse quicken. She had smelled this before, years ago, in a single microbiology textbook she'd kept after dropping out of her program. It was a volatile ester compound produced by a specific family of wild yeasts during spontaneous fermentation. Yeasts that most commercial producers spent thousands of dollars trying to eliminate. Yeasts that she had just found living in garbage fruit. 2 months earlier, Talia Rojas was 27 years old, buried in credit card debt, and living out of a rented shed on the outskirts of Stockton. The microbiology degree she'd abandoned in her 3rd year had left her with no diploma and a head full of half-finished knowledge about cellular metabolism. She'd bounced between temp jobs, lost a retail position during a round of downsizing, and watched her bank account dip below 3 digits more times than she wanted to count. The only thing she still had was an old microscope her professor had let her keep, and a stubborn belief that fermentation science held an answer she couldn't quite name yet. Every Saturday, she walked to the downtown farmers market with $5 in her pocket, enough for a bag of bruised peaches sold at a discount by growers who felt sorry for her. One morning, a stone fruit farmer named Delgado made an offhand comment. He was about to haul 200 pounds of unsellable fruit to the dump and pay $40 for the privilege. The peaches had split skins, the plums were too soft, the apricots had started to ooze. Nobody would take them. Talia told him she'd take all of it for free right now. He laughed. Then he saw her face. Within a week, 3 more farmers had heard about the strange woman who accepted rotten fruit and asked for nothing in return. The pile behind the shed grew faster than she expected. Neighbors complained about the wasps. A county inspector stopped by after an anonymous tip about illegal dumping. Talia stood in front of the heap, arms folded, and said she was conducting agricultural research. The inspector squinted at the rotting fruit, at the young woman with no credentials, and decided the paperwork wasn't worth the hassle. He left with a warning and a shake of his head. Inside the shed, Talia worked from a small wooden table cluttered with sterilized mason jars, pipettes, and nutrient agar plates she'd purchased with the last of her savings. The smell that emerged from the pile on day 4 wasn't an accident. It came from a rare strain of wild Brettanomyces, a yeast that, under the right conditions, produces aromatic compounds worth more per ounce than any fresh fruit the farmers had ever sold. She had first learned about it from a single paragraph in that fermentation textbook, on page 212, folded down at the corner because she'd meant to return to it someday. She cultured the yeast in a sterilized honey jar, isolating the strain through 3 rounds of plating and selection. It was tedious work, conducted under a clamp light she'd wired to the shed's ceiling. Most nights, she fell asleep in her chair waiting for colonies to grow. But the strain took hold. It fermented small batches of fruit into a cider that tasted like nothing she'd ever encountered: dry, complex, layered with notes of stone fruit and wildflower honey. She bottled 12 samples and drove them to a distributor in Oakland who owed her cousin a favor. The man agreed to a tasting out of sheer obligation. He unscrewed the cap, poured a half-inch into a glass, and swirled it under his nose. The silence that followed lasted longer than any answer Talia had prepared for. He set the glass down, looked at her for a long moment, and said 3 words that would change everything. The words were, "I want more." Marcus Okonkwo, the Oakland distributor, wasn't smiling. He was staring at the glass like it had just told him a secret. He wanted every bottle she had, and he wanted a standing order for the same quantity every month, starting in 60 days. Talia felt the floor tilt under her. She had 12 bottles, hand-filled in her shed, labels written in Sharpie. She didn't have a production line. She didn't have a license. She didn't even have a guarantee that the yeast strain she'd isolated would behave the same way twice. But she said yes anyway, because the alternative was walking back to a mountain of rotting fruit and admitting she'd gotten this close only to stop. The money from that first sale, $600 cash, which Marcus peeled off a roll he kept in his glove box for exactly this kind of opportunity, covered exactly one thing: an old refrigerated shipping container she found on Craigslist for $400 and towed behind her cousin's pickup truck. That container became her clean room. She scrubbed it with industrial sanitizer, installed a temperature controller, and moved her operation inside. The fruit pile stayed outside, but now the fermentation happened in controlled conditions. The Brettanomyces strain she'd named B. Talia 1, because nobody else was going to name it for her, was delicate. Too hot and it produced off flavors that tasted like Band-Aids. Too cold and it went dormant, refusing to ferment at all. Talia spent her first 2 weeks in that container sleeping on a cot next to the barrels, waking every 3 hours to check temperatures and pH levels. She lost 7 pounds she couldn't afford to lose and gained a kind of bone-deep exhaustion that made her eyes feel like sandpaper. The second batch failed anyway. She tried to scale too fast, doubling the fruit volume without adjusting the yeast pitching rate. The fermentation stuck halfway through, leaving a sweet, cloying liquid that no amount of waiting could fix. She dumped 200 gallons into the dirt behind the shed, watched it soak into the ground, and felt something crack open inside her chest. This wasn't a hobby anymore. It was a promise she'd made to a man who'd paid her $600 and expected a product that didn't exist yet. So she did what she'd always done. She opened the notebook, reviewed every variable, and started again. The breakthrough came when she stopped trying to control the yeast and started learning how to follow it. B. Talia 1 wasn't a domesticated brewery strain that behaved predictably in any environment. It was wild, specific, evolved on the skins of overripe stone fruit in California's Central Valley. It wanted heat, not the sanitized cool of a commercial brewery, but the kind of warmth that built up inside a shipping container at noon. It wanted fruit with high sugar content, fruit that was further into decay than any commercial operation would ever accept. And it wanted time. The batch that finally worked fermented for 61 days, not the 28 she'd originally planned, and it produced a cider so layered and aromatic that her second tasting with Marcus left him silent all over again. This time, when he spoke, he said, "Get ready to scale. I'm putting you in front of people who have never tasted anything like this." The people he meant were a consortium of high-end restaurants in San Francisco, buyers who specialized in single-origin everything, and were willing to pay triple-digit prices for a bottle of cider that told a story they couldn't find anywhere else. Talia's product, which she'd started calling Rotten Fruit Reserve, had exactly that story. The wild yeast, the dump-bound fruit, the girl in a shed, it hit every note the market was hungry for. Orders started coming in she couldn't fill yet. She needed more fruit, more barrels, more space. She needed money she didn't have. That was when the first letter arrived. It came on letterhead from a craft brewery in Colorado, a name she recognized because they'd been written up in brewing magazines for their wild fermentation program. The letter was polite, friendly, even complimentary. It said they'd heard about her yeast strain and were interested in a partnership. What they really wanted, she understood after reading the second page, was to buy the strain outright. They offered $50,000 for exclusive rights to B. Talia 1. $50,000. Enough to pay off every debt she had, fix the shed, buy real equipment, and still have enough left over to breathe for a year. The offer came with one condition: she would stop making cider. The strain would belong to them, their name, their labels, their story. Talia would get a check and a non-disclosure agreement. She sat with the letter for 3 days. On the fourth day, she called the number at the bottom of the page and said no. Not because 50,000 wasn't life-changing, but because the yeast didn't belong to her. It had come from the fruit, from the pile behind the shed, from the farmers who'd been throwing it away for generations. Selling it felt like selling something that had been given to her for free by an ecosystem that didn't care about exclusive rights. She hung up the phone, walked outside, and looked at the new mountain of fruit that had arrived that morning. It was bigger than any before. Word had spread among the growers that the crazy woman with the shed would take anything, and now trucks were showing up unscheduled, drivers waving at her like old friends. She had more fruit than she knew what to do with, a yeast strain she'd refused to sell, and orders stacking up from restaurants whose chefs were getting impatient. And then the second letter came, this time from a lawyer representing the brewery she'd turned down. Well, not a letter exactly. A cease and desist, alleging that her use of wild yeast constituted a public health risk and threatening to report her to the California Department of Public Health unless she agreed to a licensing arrangement with them. Talia read it in the doorway of her shipping container, the sound of fruit flies buzzing around her head, and realized with a cold, sharp clarity that she wasn't just fermenting apples anymore. She was fermenting a fight that was about to consume everything she'd built. The cease and desist wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration of war from an opponent Talia didn't even know she had. The Colorado brewery, Summit Wild Ferments, had built a reputation as a pioneer in spontaneous ales. Their marketing leaned heavily on the mystique of wild yeast, on the romance of capturing something invisible from the air. And the truth, which Talia only discovered after a frantic week of phone calls to every fermentation scientist who would take her call, was that their entire program rested on a single commercially available Brettanomyces strain they'd licensed from a lab in Belgium. There was nothing wild about it. They'd been buying their credibility in vials while she'd been isolating hers from a rotting plum behind a shed. That detail changed the shape of the letter she held. They weren't afraid she'd make someone sick. They were afraid she'd make them irrelevant. Her strain was novel, location-specific, unreplicable. Exactly the kind of story their labels pretended to tell but couldn't back up with biology. And the $50,000 offer she'd rejected wasn't a generous buyout. It was a preemptive strike, a cheap attempt to acquire and bury the one thing that might expose the gap between their marketing and their science. Talia taped the letter to the wall of her shipping container, next to a pH chart and a photograph of her grandmother who died 2 years before any of this started. She didn't have money for a lawyer. She had $18 in her checking account and a cousin who worked as a paralegal for a real estate firm in Fresno. That cousin, Letitia, read the letter over FaceTime, went quiet for a long moment, and then said, "They're bullying you. This has no teeth, but they're counting on you not knowing that." She agreed to draft a response for free, a single page citing California's cottage food laws and the fact that Talia's operation was fully permitted under a craft beverage license she'd quietly applied for months earlier, back when the first batch sold out. The brewery didn't know about the license. They'd assumed she was still operating in the shadows. That assumption would cost them. The letter from Letitia went out on a Friday. On Monday morning, an inspector from the California Department of Public Health arrived at the gate. He was polite, methodical, and armed with a clipboard full of checklists. Talia walked him through the shipping container, the temperature logs, the sanitation protocols, the batch records she'd kept in that spiral notebook. He swabbed surfaces, tested pH levels, and asked to see her yeast cultures. She showed him the agar plates, the strain isolation notes, the small library of microbiology textbooks she'd accumulated since leaving school. He closed his clipboard after an hour and a half and said, "This is one of the cleanest small batch operations I've seen in 5 years. Whoever called in the complaint might want to find a different angle. She never found out if Summit Wild Ferments actually made the call. It didn't matter. The inspection had just handed her a weapon she hadn't expected: official credibility. The inspector's report became the first page of a press kit she didn't know she'd need. A week later, a writer from a prominent craft beverage magazine called, having heard about the cease and desist through a bartender in Oakland who'd been pouring rotten fruit reserve for months. The writer wanted to know the whole story: the fruit pile, the wild yeast, the legal threat from a larger competitor. Talia told her everything. The article ran 3 weeks later under the headline, "The Rotten Fruit Rebellion." It included photographs of the shipping container, the mountain of discarded peaches, and a close-up of B. Talia one under a microscope, its cells clustered in shapes the lab photographer described as unlike any commercial strain she'd ever seen. The article did two things simultaneously. It made Talia a minor celebrity in the fermentation underground, generating orders from distributors in 6 new states. And it forced Summit Wild Ferments into a corner they hadn't anticipated. Their cease and desist was now public. Their attempt to claim a health risk had been contradicted by a state inspector, and their yeast sourcing was suddenly under scrutiny from the same community of brewers they'd spent years courting. Their legal counsel sent a second letter, this one noticeably softer, suggesting that the previous communication had been premature and that they were open to a collaborative discussion about yeast sharing. Talia read that letter aloud to Letitia over the phone, and they both laughed until they couldn't breathe. But the fight had drained her. The stress of the legal threat, the inspection, the pressure to scale while staying in compliance, it all landed in her body. She developed a persistent cough. She stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. The orders from 6 new states sat unanswered in her inbox because she couldn't produce enough cider to fill them, and she couldn't afford to expand without taking on debt she was terrified to carry. Her cousin offered to loan her $5,000 from her own savings, but Talia refused, knowing it wasn't enough to matter, and that losing it would destroy the one relationship she still trusted completely. For the first time since the smell rose from the fruit pile, she genuinely considered walking away. Not because she wanted to, but because the gap between what she'd built and what it demanded of her had become too wide to see across. Then a call came from a number she didn't recognize with a New York area code. It was a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Okonkwo, no relation to Marcus, just a coincidence of surnames, who ran a food science lab at Cornell and had read the magazine article with growing fascination. She specialized in wild yeast ecology and had spent years cataloging novel strains from unconventional sources. She wanted to study B. Talia 1. More than that, she wanted to publish a paper on it, with Talia credited as the discoverer. In the world of craft fermentation, that kind of academic validation was worth more than 100 cease and desist letters. It meant the strain would be recognized, documented, and critically, tied permanently to the person who found it. No brewery could claim ownership of a strain that had been formally described in a peer-reviewed journal with Talia's name on the byline. Talia shipped a frozen vial of B. Talia 1 to Ithaca the next morning. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that the fight might not just be winnable. It might be the beginning of something none of the people who laughed at her rotten fruit had ever seen coming. The paper landed 8 months later in the Journal of Applied Microbiology under the title, Brettanomyces thaliae, a novel wild strain isolated from overripe stone fruit in California's Central Valley. Talia's name appeared first, co-authored with Dr. Elizabeth Okonkwo and 2 of her postdoctoral researchers. The strain was now formally described, its genetic sequence deposited in a public database, its biological characteristics peer-reviewed and published. No brewery could patent it. No corporation could claim exclusive rights to something that had now been classified as a naturally occurring organism belonging to no one and everyone. Summit Wild Ferments, the Colorado brewery that had threatened her with legal ruin, issued a quiet press release 3 weeks later announcing they were refocusing their wild fermentation program on a broader range of commercially available strains. The phrasing was careful. The meaning was unmistakable. They had lost. The magazine article, the academic paper, and the sheer word of mouth from chefs who had tasted rotten fruit reserve turned Talia's tiny operation into something the market could no longer ignore. A national distributor with reach into 30 states called her directly, not through a form, not through an assistant, and asked for a launch meeting. The revenue from that first national contract alone pushed her annual sales past $180,000 before she'd even hired a real sales rep. Within 2 years, Rotten Fruit Reserve was a six-figure business, then a seven-figure one, built entirely on fermented products whose raw materials had cost her nothing more than the willingness to accept them. The farmers who once dumped their rejects for free now received a fair price per pound, a number Talia insisted on even when her accountant suggested she could keep getting the fruit for nothing. Delgado, the stone fruit grower who had given her the first truckload, became her primary supplier and her loudest advocate, telling the story at agricultural conferences to rooms full of farmers who suddenly saw their waste streams in a different light. The neighbors who called the county on her now bought bottles at the local market and told their dinner guests about the woman they once suspected of breeding fruit flies. The inspector who had warned her about illegal dumping now led tour of her facility for aspiring food entrepreneurs, and the high school classmate who posted the mocking photo of the original fruit pile. She tagged Rotten Fruit Reserve in her Instagram stories with a single word: inspired. Talia never mentioned any of it. She kept the cease and desist letter framed on the wall of her new production facility, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Stockton that now employed 11 people, but she never pointed it out to visitors. If someone noticed it and asked, she would shrug and say, "That was the moment I realized they were more scared of me than I was of them." Then she would turn back to the fermentation tanks and check the temperature. The final surprise came not from a competitor or a magazine, but from the Cornell lab that had published her strain. Dr. Okonkwo's team discovered that Betalia-1 produced a compound previously unobserved in wild Brettanomyces, a natural antimicrobial peptide that inhibited certain spoilage organisms without affecting flavor or fermentation performance. That discovery meant the strain wasn't just novel, it was functionally valuable in ways no one had anticipated. A European biotech firm offered to license the strain for industrial fermentation research. Talia agreed on one condition: the license would be non-exclusive, so any small producer who wanted to work with the strain could still access it freely through the public culture collection. That condition alone turned her into a folk hero among craft fermenters worldwide. She had been given something for nothing from a pile of rotting fruit, and she refused to become the kind of gatekeeper who would keep others from the same chance. By the time the biotech deal closed, Talia Rojas had built something no spread heat could fully capture. A business, yes. A reputation, certainly. But beneath all of it, a proof of concept. That rot was not an ending, just a different stage of chemistry, and that the most valuable things in the world sometimes arrived hidden inside what everyone else had already decided was garbage. She never forgot the first truckload. The split plums, the bruised peaches, the apricots collapsing into themselves. She never forgot the neighbors who laughed, the inspector who scoffed, the lawyer who thought a letter could scare her into silence. But mostly, she never forgot the smell, the honey-sweet note that rose from the pile and told her, in a language older than words, that nothing was finished until you decided it was. Talia Rojas built an empire from refuse because she looked at what the world called worthless and saw a question instead of an answer. The question wasn't complicated. It was simply, what else might this become? That question is still out there, hanging over every pile of discarded opportunity, waiting for someone to kneel down and notice. If this story reminded you that the best chances sometimes show up looking like nothing, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments about something you once overlooked that turned out to matter. Share this with someone who's sitting on a pile of their own right now, and let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight.